Hi, welcome to our webinar where we are going to be discussing child fine and the prior written notice, connections and considerations. I am April Ebinger. I am the Director of Psychological and Behavioral Services with the Tennessee Department of Education. Today on our webinar, we will be digging into a variety of topics, including child fine requirements, pre-referral and early intervention considerations, what needs to occur during those referrals, how to write a strong prior written notice given certain contexts and certain meeting types, and then connecting child fine and our obligations under child fine with our prior written notice. So what are those child fine requirements and regulations? Let's first look at some of our data around eligibility categories, and this is from 2023. You'll notice in red our state prevalence rates of our eligibility categories, and in blue are our national rates. SLD continues to be the highest area of eligibility, the largest area of eligibility for our students with disabilities. However, as you notice here, speech and language impairment is not far behind. Since we transitioned from a discrepancy model under specific learning disability to the RTI model, we have noticed marked decreases in our prevalence of specific learning disabilities across the states. You'll notice how the others rank and are somewhat comparable to our national areas of identification. And where you do see any significant gaps, this is where we as the department work with districts to identify those concerns or issues related to disproportionate representation to help address those in multiple ways, whether looking at evaluation practices or pre-referral practices that may need to be modified. Ultimately, though, when we're talking about child fine, we're ensuring that we're seeking out, identifying, and evaluating all children ages 3 to 22 who may have disabilities. Those are students also who may be homeless or transient. They may be enrolled in our public schools. They may be enrolled in our local private schools. They may be enrolled in our local daycares or Head Starts. And regardless of the severity of their disability or disabilities, we need to seek out, identify, and evaluate. This also includes our obligation to those students who are migrants or English language learners, or even those who are involved with our correctional facilities. We are bound to find all students with disabilities ages 3 to 22 wherever they may be found. Okay? So why child fine? Again, our obligation is to seek out and find these students, but ultimately it's to ensure that we can provide them that free and appropriate public education. This includes any special education or related services that they may require. And ultimately, this is to ensure that they have future independence, employment, and further education if they so choose once they leave us. Our motto often is graduation is not the goal, it's where we're going to prepare them to get to after they graduate high school. We also want to ensure that we're developing out a robust early intervention system that is going to not only prepare students to enter the K-12 setting, but that's going to ensure that we can find them through multiple intervention methods, whether that is early childhood screenings or other activities where we can seek out and find these children across our public school, pre-K settings, VPKs, or other settings, or through our local daycares and local preschools and Head Start community centers. So when we think about pre-referral and early interventions, what are some things that we should be considering, right? And many of you would agree that these are some areas that we need to consider. Can they see, right? Can they hear? So being able to rule out vision and hearing early on is certainly something that your teams need to consider. Many of our school districts have this embedded within their either their onboarding for students who are coming into kindergarten, maybe doing like a preschool or kindergarten roundup where they do either developmental profiles, vision and hearing screens to ensure that they have what they need in terms of corrective lenses or hearing aids or devices to ensure that they are able to access instruction. We need to also talk about cultural differences, language acquisition, and potentially a lack of instruction. All of these things need to be considered by your team, but these alone would not be reasons to deny an evaluation for a student, but to consider how they are impacting the student's ability to make reasonable and calculated progress towards those grade level standards. Again, when we think about some of these rule outs as well, these are also often called exclusionary factors when we think of a specific learning disability, because we need to be able to rule out that these are not the primary cause of a child's inability to achieve at grade level, but certainly these can also play a role that we need to evaluate for, or we need to mitigate for, to provide glasses if the student cannot see the board from the back of the room. So we need to consider these as a team as we embark on our evaluation practice or process. So, what are some other things we need to consider around referrals? So, your referral process in general, we advise you that you need to establish and communicate those clear referral procedures and practices to your interested parties. That means we need to post these referral procedures on your LEA's website. We need to engage in activities where we can engage parents, not only those enrolled in your local public school system, but those who may be enrolled in local private schools as well. But we need to ensure consistency across the district. We don't want high school X to be doing one thing and high school Y to be doing another process. The process of the referral process should be consistent across your district and across providers. A parent or district may refer for a child for an evaluation at any time. Okay, we're going to talk about this a little bit more on subsequent slides, but really a child can be referred at any point, regardless of their inclusion into any tiered interventions, because at any point, the parent or teacher or other public agency official, if they suspect a disability, they should exercise their obligation to refer, and then we should exercise our child find obligation to initiate the process to evaluate. The team must consider and decide if a disability is suspected. If you do have a parent who requests an evaluation, but you have no indication that the child may be a child with a disability after reviewing multiple pieces of data and having multiple stakeholders provide input, then you absolutely can decline to conduct that evaluation formally through a prior written notice. But if you do suspect a disability, then you must propose an initial evaluation, build out that initial consent assessment plan, and obtain initial informed consent from that parent or guardian. Parent consent is required for an initial evaluation, and parents must again receive prior written notice of that evaluation and or that refusal to complete the evaluation within 10 days of that decision to propose or refuse that evaluation. So just some reminders around our timelines. So LEAs have 60 calendar days from the date of receipt of initial informed consent from the parents or guardians to conduct that evaluation and determine eligibility. So keep in mind, within our TM Pulse system, we have the luxury of having, electronic signatures. But if you just so happen to be in a situation where the parent, you print off the copy, the parent says, I'm not going to sign this today. I'm going to take this home and I'm going to discuss this with my significant other. And then they take the document with them. Keep in mind that the timeline does not begin until the LEA receives that signed document back to them. And then you will in the system need to confirm receipt of that initial consent on the initial eligibility page, and that will start your timeline, and you will be able to track that timeline within the TM Pulse system. Timeline extensions are allowable for initial evaluations only if they meet certain conditions. So keep that in mind. IDA, our federal law, allows for 3 allowable justifications to extend that timeline. One of those is the parent repeatedly failed to produce the child for the evaluation. If you select that, then please, in the rationale comments box, tell us how often did you try to engage? How many times did you schedule the evaluation meeting with the parent and they failed to produce the child? How many phone calls? How many emails did you make? All of that should be noted in your context tab as well. Another reason that's allowable for a timeline extension is that the child transferred from a district that obtained consent prior to determining eligibility. So maybe they are coming in from your neighboring district. They obtained initial informed consent, but they weren't able to complete the evaluation before the child transferred and enrolled in your district. Then that is an allowable reason for you to request a timeline extension. Please give us that information within the rationale comments box after you checked that allowable reason. The final reason that LEAs may request a timeline extension is if there is a written agreement between the parent and the team, essentially, that group of qualified professionals, to extend a timeline for a specific learning disability evaluation. Keep in mind that within your rationale of why you need more time for SLD, that we will not approve timeline extensions if you are speaking to you need more data points, or you need more time in intervention, or you need to change the intervention, or if you're talking about the process of RTI, we're not talking about the child, we're talking about the process. That timeline extension will more than likely be refused and declined. When we're talking about an extension for an SLD evaluation, this is really indicating that the child may be making good progress in that intervention, and the team needs more time to truly suss out if it is a learning difference versus a disability. And so it is not, again, about the process itself. It is about the child making progress, and we need more time to ensure that the child really does not have a disability. We, as the Department of Ed, will approve acceptable timeline extensions in 30-day increments, and you're allowed to, if necessary, apply for another timeline extension if you do need more time and you have met the requirements in order to justify. But we will always encourage you to complete these evaluations in a timely manner, because again, we want to ensure that if the child does qualify, that is the fastest way to get them to that free and appropriate public education within their least restrictive environment. Some common mistakes that we see on our side of things around referrals for special education evaluations, as you can see here, first is determining and predetermining eligibility before evaluating. So when we, especially on the next few slides, we'll talk about some predetermining factors that often arise around specific learning disability, but telling parents or telling guardians, oh, your child won't qualify because of X. They won't qualify because I listened to them in the hallway and they don't have a speech language impairment. They're not in tiered intervention, so they won't qualify for a specific learning disability. Whatever that is, we have to be very cautious that we are making that determination without formally evaluating the child to determine if they meet or do not meet our educational criteria. Another common mistake is around the delay of evaluation. So ensuring that you have written referral procedures that includes a timeline. Many of our districts require a certain period of time between when they hear about the referral to signing that initial consent. We recommend it happens within a reasonable time frame, and typically that would be 10 calendar days, but certainly there may be other barriers that prevent that from happening. But your district should have written referral procedures that talks about what happens if the teacher receives a referral, what happens if the principal receives the referral, who is contacted, how is that communicated, where is that documented, making sure that all of our teams are on the same page and we know how to implement these procedures consistently across the district. An incomplete assessment plan. So we hear about this often at the state education agency. We start an evaluation for X, and as we're evaluating, oh, now it looks like Y. Well, that's where your strong referral, pre-referral practices come into play. We should be sitting down with our teams, and as we are deciding whether to evaluate or not evaluate, we should be collecting a lot of evidence to understand what are we suspecting and what are we evaluating for. There really should be very few surprises through that evaluation process for your assessment team. We should have a really clear understanding of the concerns of the parent and of the teacher before we build out that assessment plan. We also recommend that you're utilizing the assessment documentation forms to ensure that you are hitting on all areas of disability and those required assessment components as you're evaluating. What we see most often for students is missing the required direct observations. Keep in mind that informal observation forms, so input from the teacher or input from a related service provider, is valuable information, but it does not meet the threshold of a direct observation, meaning your eyeballs on the kid in their educational environment, looking at characteristics of autism or looking at their lack of progress towards grade level standards for SLD. Okay. So incorrect date on initial informed consent. please keep in mind again that this is the date you received initial consent from the parent with their signature. If they signed it electronically sitting next to you, then you know that that's the date that you received that initial informed consent. But again, we would always recommend having written procedures around that consent date, and then again ensuring that your teams are going back, confirming that date within the TM Pulse system, making sure that's done before you get to the eligibility meeting. And then missing or incomplete prior written notices. We do always recommend that there's some level of self-monitoring from LEAs throughout the year. You're going to see once we get to the prior written notice section, some recommendations on other things that LEAs can do, but we would always encourage our LEAs to monitor their own internal prior written notices to ensure that they are robust enough in order to justify the decisions and the determinations that happened in each of those IEP meetings. So when we think through RTI, response to intervention and instruction squared and child fine, here are some concerns that we want to throw at you in terms of some cautions. We want to focus on the data, not the process. Often within RTI, we have lost the child through the weeds of the process of RTI. Well, they need 45 minutes, 5 days a week of this intervention. Well, but they need reading and math, but they need reading and written expression. Well, we can only give them this because we have to prioritize this. Folks, when we start talking in that type of language, we're missing the child. We give the child what the child needs. And our LEAs and our RTI manual afford a lot of flexibility in how we do that. We need to focus on the data, not the process. Focus on the child and then be responsive to that data. If we notice that the child has stagnated and they're not making progress, and our team says, well, we've made some changes to the intervention, they're still not making progress, maybe we need to refer them for a special education evaluation, even if we haven't collected 8 to 10 data points. We need to be responsive to that data and serve the child, not the process. Again, we're going to respond appropriately to requests for evaluation. That means that if a parent or another public agency official requests that evaluation, we're going to do so formally and make that decision through a prior written notice. But what we're not going to do is decline to even consider the evaluation because we don't have enough data points or they have to go through RTI first. That is not required under any of our state board rules or any of our guidance documents. Again, we serve the child, and if we suspect a disability, we evaluate. Again, we are going to avoid predetermination. They haven't been in RTI long enough. If I test them now, they're not going to qualify. Again, that's just not true. A student can be referred for an SLD evaluation at any point, even if they're not in a tiered intervention. They can be referred and then placed into an intervention as we're evaluating formally for a special education eligibility area. So again, all decisions are made by the team. If they meet criteria in specific learning disability and then show that adverse impact to educational performance, again, those decisions are made by the team. But what we don't want to do is prevent the process from even occurring because we assume the child won't qualify because the RTI manual dictates a certain number of weeks in intervention, which it doesn't. Okay. Again, we're going to refer if we suspect a disability because those processes can happen concurrently. They can happen at the same time. We do not require a specific weeks in intervention, a specific number of data points. We don't require a specific cut score to qualify for intervention. Just some words of caution. I pulled this out for our SLD presentation that we've done previously, but IDEA is very clear that a child does not have to be failing at school to qualify for an evaluation. We have a lot of students out there that are passing grade to grade and that are, being promoted from grade to grade. They may make all A's and B's and they still would warrant an evaluation under special education. We can't assume just because they're not failing that they don't have a disability that would justify a reason to evaluate under state and federal law. Also, IDA never carves out that the student must be performing at the bottom 10%. or at below the 25th percentile. None of that none of that lives in our state or federal guidance. I know that our previous old RTI manual talked a lot about 10th and 25th percentile, but our new RTI manual does not. And our guidance is that we consider each child on a case-by-case basis. And if we suspect a disability wherever they fall on that spectrum, on that bell curve, we consider that and we formally decide through that prior written notice if we're going to evaluate or not evaluate. Again, IDA does not say that the child must have completed certain types of general education interventions to qualify for an evaluation. If we suspect a disability, we evaluate. And if that means that through that evaluation process, we need to engage in some interventions, then we do that through the 60-day timeline. We don't prevent it from the evaluation from happening because we haven't started interventions yet. Okay, so let's jump in real quick to our prior written notice. So prior written notice must be given to parents of a child with a disability within at least 10 school days before, okay, that we propose or refuse to initiate or change the identification, evaluation, or educational placement of that child or that provision of FAPE, that free and appropriate public education. So we must provide written notice to the parents when we are proposing anything regarding that child's program, identification, eligibility, any of that, or if we're refusing. So keep that in mind because, I was just talking about if a parent requested an evaluation and the team says, no, we have no reason to, we have all this information saying that the child does not have a disability and you want to refuse that, we're going to do that through that prior written notice mechanism. So the language of that notice, it must be written in a language understandable to the general public, meaning that we're going to be really cautious about using acronyms. Special education is very rich in acronyms. So we have FAPE and LRE and SLD and OHI and an IEP, right? We have to be cautious of that. It needs to be understandable to the general public, and our parents should be able to pick up that document and easily understand what was happening in that meeting. It must be provided in the native language of the parent or another mode of communication provided or used by that parent, unless it's not clearly or easily visible to do that, right? Or feasible to do that. So you know that our T-Impulse system will translate our prior written notices in one of our top 7 languages. And if you need to have a translator translate documents on your behalf, then you'll need to access that through your LEA. If the native language or other mode of communication is not a written language, then you must make sure that you take steps to ensure that the notice is translated orally or through another means, that they understand the contents of that notice, and that there's written evidence that the requirements of that notice, that prior written notice, have been met, okay? And I would document somewhere, whether it's in parent contacts or through some other mechanism that this has occurred if you're having to use other mechanisms to communicate the prior written notice to parents. Keep in mind that the prior written notice is used to document decisions made but not yet acted upon by the IEP team. And again, the basis for those decisions. So if we're proposing an initial evaluation for a child because we suspect a specific learning disability, that doesn't mean we've already evaluated. That means that we're notifying the parent that we are proposing an initial evaluation, and we must provide that prior written notice to parents essentially after or before we are able to evaluate. So parents must be notified that we are getting ready to propose an evaluation. We've already received your initial informed consent, and now we're going to evaluate, okay? So when do we need to provide this? It's after the meeting, after we made the decision to propose or refuse the evaluation. Now we're going to provide that. We're not going to provide the prior written notice before the meeting. And I know that the name in and of itself sounds a little off because it says prior written notice. So some people assume that that means before the meeting. It does not. Remember, it's based on decisions not made, but not yet acted upon. So prior to acting upon those decisions, we're going to provide written notice to the parent. They must be done in a timely manner. The notice must be provided so that parents have enough time to fully consider what that proposal or refusal is and to be able to respond to the action before it's implemented. So Tennessee state rules, essentially our state board rule requires that the notice must be sent at least 10 school days prior to that proposal or refusal to initiate or change that plan. And then providing prior written notice in advance of meetings could suggest, again, in some circumstances, that you guys are predetermining what is going to happen in that meeting. So please be cautious and engage with parent input. Document that you obtain parent input through that meeting process and document that on the prior written notice. That would be great. A great suggestion to do to ensure that parents have had meaningful opportunity to participate in the process. So as I mentioned, these are the 4 areas for which we are going to write a prior written notice, and often we'll get questions, well, April, does this qualify as a reason to write a prior written notice? I can think of very few things, if any, that would not require a prior written notice for a student. So let's just talk through a couple of the circumstances that would require a prior written notice. Again, if you are proposing to conduct an initial evaluation, a reevaluation, if you're proposing to use that additional consents feature, additional assessments feature within T-Impulse. So you're going to do an FBA or BIP, or you're going to do an OT eval. That requires a prior written notice. If you don't conduct an evaluation or you refuse to conduct that initial evaluation, that requires a prior written notice. And then if you're going to not essentially fund that independent educational evaluation, that IE, that requires a prior written notice as well, and filing due process, right? Identification. So you determine eligibility, or you're changing an eligibility category, or you're terminating eligibility. All of that requires and triggers the need for a prior written notice. And then educational placement, the initial provision of services, where are you placing them? Change to placement, change to LRE, change for disciplinary reasons. Maybe you're remanded a student to the alternative school. Unilateral, parentally, privately placed students. So maybe the student pulls the child out, they're accessing an IEA, and that would trigger the need for a prior written notice. And then the provision of FAPE, any changes to the IEP, any changes to special education, related services, accommodations, modifications, or maybe even your refusal to change a service or modify a service, changes to transportation, really anything that would be substantive within the IEP is going to trigger a need for a prior written notice. So keep in mind that any changes to that IEP, you're more than likely, you're going to always have to write a prior written notice. We would also recommend a prior written notice if the parents revoke consent, or if the team for any reason refuses to conduct an IEP meeting at parent request, for whatever reason, document that. So documenting comparable services when the student transfers in from out of state, document that in a prior written notice. ESY determinations, graduation with the regular ed diploma, terminating services, and then MDR decisions. Document all of that within a prior written notice. So what must a prior written notice include? You'll see all of these. This is just exactly what you see when you open that prior written notice document within T-Impulse. It walks you through each of these boxes. So let's talk a little bit about what should be included in each of these. I'm going to show you a few non-examples as we go through here. So I went and pulled some prior written notices from across the state. So typically when we do this webinar, we have some interaction and we can talk about what to do and what not to do. I will just kind of talk through some of our concerns of some of the ones we pulled, as well as some areas in which that districts can improve. So again, the first box is you're going to describe the actions proposed or refused. You want to provide a good, clear, but succinct explanation of each of those proposals. So for an initial evaluation, what are you suspecting? You're proposing an initial evaluation. What do you suspect? Do you suspect a specific learning disability in basic reading? Do you suspect a developmental delay? Do you suspect other health impairment due to the student's current medical diagnosis of diabetes? What do you propose and why? Or you're refusing. The LEA refuses an initial evaluation to determine if a specific learning disability in basic reading is present. Okay, tell us what that is. But we also want to be cautious to not provide enough detail, but then not to provide too much detail. Again, if we are too vague in our descriptions on our priority notes, that could also set us up for some issues. So be very clear about each proposal and or each refusal. So look at this example here. Please note again that these are only used for training purposes, but the description of actions proposed or refused. The IEP team met to discuss this student's goals, objectives, transition services, and ESY. My question to you would be, what did you discuss? What did you propose? Will the goals stay the same? Will they change? Are the objectives changing? Are they becoming more rigorous, less rigorous? What are the transition services? What did the team agree? Does this student propose that they need ESY? Did they propose they didn't need ESY? This tells me very little about the substance of this meeting, and your obligation is to provide us very clear descriptions of what was proposed. And in this case, you told us very vaguely and generally what occurred, but I really don't have a good understanding of what occurred in this meeting. Look at this example here. The team met today to discuss a triennial reevaluation. The mother could not attend but requested I sign her name where required. Parents' rights booklets, along with a copy of the reevaluation, were sent home. The school psychologist completed the gap in the rate of improvement and determined that her gap was not significant. But after discussion with everyone else, the team thinks that this student continues to need SPED support to be successful in that classroom, especially going into high school. The child has been improving tremendously in her classes, but the team was not comfortable with exiting her out of special education altogether just yet. The child will remain eligible for SPED services under the qualification of SLD. I bet many of you are probably shivering and shaking in your boots with this prior written notice section. There are a number of issues here, right? First, we never sign for parents. Never. If they do not attend the meeting and they agree they're not going to attend the meeting, then you certainly can send documents home, either through our Parent Connect portal on TN Pulse, or you can send home hard copies, but we do not sign for parents. Another thing is, in this, we said that we use the rate of improvement in gap, and it appears her gap's not significant. Does that alone mean the child does not qualify for SLD? No. We cannot rely on one measure in order to determine eligibility or termination of eligibility. We have to look at a variety of sources of data. This team appeared to not do that. Again, they also said that the child may not be eligible. If she may not be eligible, it would be their obligation to conduct additional assessments to determine that. And we also do not maintain eligibility just based on our hopes, dreams, wishes, or comfortability, right? We have to have data to support that the child continues to meet criteria and show an adverse educational impact. And if we don't have data to support that, or we have data that's conflicting in this case, we are bound to collect additional data through that reevaluation process and to ensure that the child meets criteria. And the team saying that they don't think she meets criteria, but we're going to keep it on there because we're uncomfortable, would be a breach of our obligations under state and federal law. So then the next part of this is we're going to explain why. Why are you proposing or refusing to take this action, right? And you'll see here that we have some case law that's cited down here, and you certainly can explore this on your own. But we need to ensure that we've explained thoroughly why we're proposing or refusing. We're not just saying that we're proposing an initial evaluation and then saying, well, the parent requested it. Why do we support that proposal? What evidence do we have to say that the child was a child with a disability and that we have some justification to evaluate? Each action taken must have a reason. So if you go back to that first one that said we're going to look at goals, objectives, transition services, and ESY, now tell me what you've proposed and why. We're going to maintain the student's reading goal as a student's making progress, but they have not yet reached their end of year goal from last year. So we're going to keep the We're going to keep the threshold the same. We're going to modify the objective to add an additional objective to ensure that the students' adaptive skills are appropriately noted. We're going to change the transition services to start preparing them for their post-secondary goals. So we're going to start working with our CTE teachers on getting that child where they need to be, right? Give us the justification and the meat of that. The team proposed ESY because the team has sufficient data to indicate when there are elongated breaks, the child shows regression across their IEP goals. Give us the explanation here. The child was proposed for an initial evaluation for specific learning disability and basic reading skills. Number 2, explain why. Based on current classroom and tiered intervention data, the child has failed to make reasonable progress over the last 6 weeks in intervention. The child continues to perform 2 to 3 grade levels below. Give us the meat of why you suspect the disability here or why you're proposing or refusing to take the position you are. Let's look at some examples. Explanation of why. Student's evaluation report needed to be discussed and eligibility needed to be determined. This is not telling me anything around the reason why you proposed or refused. Just because it is a state or federal requirement, it doesn't tell me why you still have proposed to keep that goal the same or why you were holding that triennial reevaluation. Give us the meat of why you're proposing or refusing. Explanation of why the school system proposed or refused to take this action. This action is considered to be good practice to ensure that this student is receiving the accommodation that he needs in order to be more successful. Again, I don't really know what that means, but this is not a clear explanation of why you proposed to initiate an annual IEP meeting, or you propose to keep parts of the IEP the same, or to modify parts of the IEP, or to reevaluate. Tell us what data you have to support that proposal or that refusal. Number 3, other options considered. I would say historically, 3 and 4 on the prior written notice are the areas that we see that are typically empty or they're not completed as necessary. But this is where you want to include options considered, including your parent requests. So you come to an IEP meeting and maybe the parent requests that the student has a one-on-one. Well, you're going to ensure that you're collecting data to support your proposal for a one-on-one or your refusal for the one-on-one, right? And if you refuse the one-on-one, right, where are we going to document that? In box number 1, right, where the LEA proposed refuse. And if the parent comes back and says, okay, well, you refused this, now under box 3, you're going to tell us what other options did you consider? Well, you considered the parent's request to have a one-on-one, and ultimately you refuse that, which is fine, but you need to document somewhere that you considered other options. If you're approaching an annual IEP meeting and the team is discussing maybe changing an IEP goal, your other options considered were maybe maintaining that goal and not changing it. And maybe your team was discussing adding accommodation, but your other options considered is maybe not adding that accommodation. For every decision we make in the SPED world, we have other options considered and they need to be documented here. Where LEAs fail is where they say no other options were considered. You are required under federal law to consider other options and to document that in your prior written notice. Let's look at this example. The school system did not make any other considerations for this child as it seemed to be a good fit for him. Again, you're required under federal law to consider other options, including potentially what the parent has proposed to the team. So in this case, maybe the parent or the team considered doing a comprehensive reevaluation for the child, okay? And you chose not to do that. Your proposal is that you were going to maintain eligibility for that child through a file review, which you can do, but then document that you considered that you weren't going to do it through file review, because hopefully your team did have that conversation at that meeting. Look at this one. We consider moving this child to consult services. This is not wrong. I don't mind this at all because it sounds like this child is receiving direct services and they propose to continue to receive direct services. And in this box, they said, before you propose keeping that child in direct services, we consider moving to consult. That's perfect, right? We want to show and document that we've considered other options other than what we proposed or refused. And then box 4. So you've considered these other options. Why did you reject those options, right? The parent requested a one-on-one. Box 4 is going to tell me why you rejected that, okay? Or let's see, the team was discussing to move a child to a more intensive behavioral placement due to maladaptive behaviors. And ultimately, you decided to provide some additional behavioral supports within their current LRE. Now tell us you considered moving that child to a more restrictive setting. Now tell us why you rejected. Well, based on our current data collection, the child appears to be making some progress towards their replacement goals and their BIP, and the team agreed that the less restrictive environment was more appropriate to continue to work towards these replacement goals. Okay, let's look at some examples. Another one. Reasons above were rejected. This does not apply as the team did not make any other considerations. Again, you have to consider other options. And if you consider that option, then tell us why you chose not to go that path, why you chose not to go that direction. Okay, give us the justification, give us the data. No items were rejected. Again, this clearly tells me that you haven't considered any other options, which again is in violation of your requirements under federal law. So please consider other options and then document here that you've done that. So box 5, description of the procedures. What did you use as a basis for your proposal or your refusal? So think through with an initial evaluation. What data did you consider and what did you propose, right, to make the determination that you needed an initial evaluation? You probably looked at progress monitoring data, benchmark data, teacher input, parent input, and now you're proposing to conduct achievement testing, observations, right? A gap analysis, rate of improvement. Maybe you're going to do an additional cognitive assessment. Tell us what you use as a basis for your proposal or your refusal, okay? Now let's look at some examples. This one says attendance, test scores, teacher input. Is this wrong? No, it's not wrong, but does it clearly encapsulate all of the rich data that I know that you've considered? I know a lot of our districts are what we would define as very data rich. We have a lot of data systems out there. I know you've considered those. Tell us what those are. You've looked at the progress reports for the IEPs. You looked at their progress monitoring, their benchmark assessments. You looked at all the evidence that you've collected from the teacher observations and the parent information systems, right? You've collected a lot of rich information. Document that you've used that and you've considered that here. Look at this example, teacher observations and grades. Again, this is not wrong per se, but we know that regardless of any decision that you've made, you probably would have considered more information and you're just not capturing that here well, right? We need to ensure that we are looking at all the rich data that you've collected and that you're doing yourself a favor, right? By documenting what you've considered here. Box 6, we want to ensure that we consider other factors relevant to the action proposed, and we need to be cautious to document superfluous information, but we also need to ensure that this is document important information that is relevant to that meeting purpose, right? And this case law down here, pardon me, this case law down here references where a school district erred because they cited a specific methodology. So, for example, maybe it was utilizing Wilson Reading or Orton Gillingham, and they kind of locked themselves into a box here because then at some point they realized they wanted to change that methodology, change the intervention itself. And they were unable to do that because they had it locked in that prior written notice. So be cautious about that and consult with your SPED directors, consult with your local board attorneys as necessary to really understand what would be considered too intense in terms of methodology and what would be appropriate to include. Let's look at some examples here. Other factors relevant to this action proposed are parent input. Again, this is not wrong. I'm not quite sure how this would be captured here. I would much prefer that you talk about parent input in box 5, where we talk about all the data that you use to justify that proposal or that refusal, parent input, parent interviews, parent rating scales, whatever that is. I would document that more so in box 5 than I would in box 6, but it's not wrong. Okay, it's not wrong. Look at this example. Parents' rights were offered. They declined another copy. I love this inclusion. I always recommend that we say we offered parents procedural safeguards. They accepted. They declined. We reviewed the procedural safeguards. Parents asked questions in these contexts, or parents decline to ask questions. I love that. Some LEAs document, especially if you're still having virtual meetings, some of them document who attended virtually, what their roles, what their titles were. Others document other considerations. I'll give you a real life example that kind of saved me. Is I was doing some summer assessment in a district, and at that eligibility meeting, we hadn't gotten to the IEP. We're just determining eligibility. The child who was getting ready to enroll in kindergarten was found eligible to be identified as intellectually gifted. And the mother in that meeting said, well, I want my child to be accelerated. I want her to skip kindergarten. Well, I said, okay, that's really an administrative decision in consultation with the IEP team. So here are the processes and the procedures to reach out to that administrator, talk about that with them, and then determine next steps. And lo and behold, the LEA from that school called me that next week and said, how dare you? Because the parent went back and said that I said, Dr. Ebinger said that my child could skip kindergarten. Well, box 6 was my saving grace, because what I documented in box 6 was that this was not the IEP team's decision for acceleration. I documented that I told her what the process and procedures were, and that in consultation with the IEP team, the administrator would make the decision around acceleration for this child. And so this really protected me. So think through also documenting issues around truancy in this box that are relevant to what you're proposing, relevant to the provision of faith that may be at play, and you need to document those here. Some other final considerations around prior written notices and some cautions. Prior written notices must include the student's eligibility category when doing so is necessary to affect the purpose of the notice. So anytime we're talking about an initial evaluation or a reevaluation or any type of determination of eligibility, please document and write out what the area of eligibility is being suspected, which one's being certified, and please be cautious about using acronyms. In this case, this letter to anonymous, districts must provide this prior written notice when proposing a functional behavioral assessment, as we mentioned before. So if you are proposing an FBA BIP outside of the initial evaluation or reevaluation process, and maybe you're using that consent form for additional assessments, you still need to write a prior written notice. And then prior written notices must provide sufficient detail to allow parents to participate in their child's educational services in an informed way. And in this case, they found that the district erred because they failed to explain the reasons why for that student's classification of multiplied handicapped, which again, many of you on the call know that that's multiple disabilities is how that reads. And by failing to adequately detail the rationale for rejecting 2 private school placement options, meaning that's critical, as we talked about, the parent proposed a private school placement, and instead of documenting that proposal and their consideration of that and why they ultimately rejected it in the prior written notice, the district erred. That's where your prior written notice can come back and really save you if you use it in the manner in which it was intended. So generally, a district isn't required to provide a prior written notice when it refuses to utilize a specific educational methodology. Keep in mind, if, though, that current methodology is a part or a provision of FAPE, then you would need to utilize a prior written notice for that. But you'll see here the IEP listed e-therapy as a location of the child services because the parents asked that the services be provided in person. The district was required to formally notify the parent of its decision to continue to provide therapy online. So all of those parent proposals or considerations, it's in your best interest to document those within a prior written notice, to formally document those, that they have been provided notice and they understand their dispute resolution rights if they disagree with whatever the LEA lands on. Some additional cautions: providing parents with verbal notice as a substitute for that prior written notice does not fulfill the requirements of the prior written notice under IDA. So we need to ensure that just because you tell parents something, if it meets the threshold of the identification, evaluation, placement, or the provision of FAPE, we need to do so formally through a prior written notice. And then a district here violated the IDA by failing to provide the prior written notice to reflect the change in the student's educational placement. So if, and we're hearing a lot of this from across the state, where some of our LEAs are trying to be creative in serving students, but you can't just pick up a student with a disability and move them without a formal notice to the parent, and to propose that formally through that IEP process, because parents are entitled to meaningful participation in any decisions around their child and their plan and their placement. A district's failure to provide a prior written notice within a reasonable timeframe before it implements a change constitutes, again, a procedural violation that may constitute a denial of FAPE. So again, keep that in mind as you're thinking through providing that notice to parents. And if you're in the business of having a meeting and sending the prior written notice many days after, I would just proceed with caution. We need to inform parents and provide notice as soon as possible, so that does not delay not only our implementation of the plan, but the execution of FAPE within that child's LRE. Receipt of notice. So the IDA does not require that districts ask parents to acknowledge that, meaning that I know a lot of districts out there, they'll have the parents sign that they've received the prior notice. There's nothing requiring you to do that. But if your districts require that of you, then follow your district's policies and procedures. But you need to have some level of documentation that you have provided notice. So if you look at this Columbus City School District case here, noting that the parent signature on the student's IEP coupled with the check marks next to the box showed that the parents received their procedural safeguards, showed that the district adhered to the IDA's notice requirements. So making sure that you're documenting sufficiently within the T-Impulse system, within all of our levels of documentation. And we have tried to build out all of those check boxes and dates and parent signatures in order to protect our LEAs. All right. And then a prior written notice without a meeting. There may be times that you can hold an IEP or change something within the IEP without having to hold an IEP meeting. This is something that is carved out within IDA that allows you to make an amendment or a change to a student's plan if the parent agrees in writing to that without holding a meeting. But keep in mind that a prior written notice would still be required even if there is no meeting. Okay, so if the parent agreed to maybe make a minor change, maybe one of your services was mislabeled on the IEP and you call the parent, okay, mom and dad, I kind of made a mistake. I'm going to change this on the IEP. I'm going to send you home the finalized updated copy. Do you agree? Do you approve that we can make this change without having to come back and do a formal IEP meeting? Yes, I agree. Can you send that attestation to me in an email? Sure. And then you can do that, but a prior written notice would still be required in this case. Just some final best practices here. Avoid leaving blanks. Avoid using not applicable, NA. If you're saying NA or not applicable on any of the boxes on the prior written notice, you're probably missing something and you need to go back and consider what needs to be included. Again, we need to ensure that we're not using unnecessary abbreviations or jargon. We need to make it in a language understandable to any lay person, and that would include an administrative law judge who potentially picks this up through a due process case. They need to understand what was proposed to refuse in that meeting. Make sure it's understandable to them, as well as making sure it's understandable to our parents. They deserve to know and to be fully informed of what's happening with their child's educations. And then please proofread. We see a lot of typos within prior written notices. We see wrong names. We see wrong eligibility categories. We see a lot of typos, and we need to be cautious of that. Make sure the dates are correct. Make sure that the statements are correct and that they're free from errors. And then again, just make sure that prior written notice is comprehensive enough for that current situation. And if you start to see within your district that the prior written notices look the same time, meeting after meeting, that should cause you some concern. Prior written notices should always be individualized to that individual student's needs and those meeting outcomes and the decisions that were made. If we see blanket statements that are the same, that would be similar to every single kid having the exact same IEP. That's going to be problematic. Now, making some connections here requires strong internal processes and procedures. Make sure we have written processes and procedures that are available to our interested parties across the state and to the public at large, and that are easily accessible. They call for specificity. It's okay to include timelines and deadlines and due dates. Our state board rule requires a lot of timelines and deadlines and due dates. Make sure your internal processes and procedures do the same. And then this always establishes that foundation for educational programming and planning. All of this that we talked about today, whether through Child Find or prior written notice, this is all about ensuring that we are setting our students up for success and providing them a free and appropriate public education to get them to their goals in the post-secondary environment. And so again, I want you to always consider that I know that some of these processes and procedures are time consuming and it's paperwork. I get it. But don't ever forget that there is a child, a student attached to each and every one of these documents, and they deserve our time and attention to provide them meaningful education and meaningful opportunities to engage with their same age non-disabled peers. I appreciate your time today. Jamie Seek was not on the call today, but if you have any questions or concerns, you can reach out to us. Jamie Seek is our Related Services and Speech Languages Coordinator. I, again, am April Ebinger. I look forward to working with you as you embark on beefing up and ramping up your child find processes and your prior written notices. Thank you so much, and I hope you have a wonderful afternoon.